I grew up with Bob Dylan's music. The first time I could afford, for example, a real gift from my mom, what I got her was the Biograph box set. For dual enrollment English in high school, I did a poetry analysis of Positively 4th Street. My first band covered Like a Rolling Stone, and at a benefit one time, we played that song in front of a prison for the benefit of spouses of incarcerated fathers. The Freight Train Band, the band I was in with my father, covered Highway 61, Knocking on Heaven's Door, and we even got Butch out from behind the kit to be the front man on Subterranean Homesick Blues. And my father wanted to prepare a college lecture on Desolation Row. There are so many stories I could tell. For one example, when I was in college and I would take the bus around FSU, I always had my cassette Walkman. And one of the things that I listened to the most frequently was a cassette copy of Freewheelin'. My girlfriend had made it for me. And it was one of those where right in the middle of I Shall Be Free, at the end of it, it stopped abruptly because she had made a cassette copy of off the LP, and that was where the tape ended. Well, my telephone rang, it would not stop. It was John F. Kennedy calling me up. He said, my friend Bob, what do we need to make the country grow? I said, my friend John, Bridget Bardot, Anita Ekberg. It would be like a decade until I learned how that song actually ended. The point is, I know and I love the music of Bob Dylan, but for whatever reason, John Wesley Harding is one that slipped past me, and it's well past time for me to correct that. This is a sparse band. It's pretty much just Dylan, only with bass and drums. And ironically, after his big breakout to the electric guitar, all of these songs are either on acoustic guitar or piano. The sound is not only sparse, but from what I'm hearing, not much in the way of arrangements have been agreed on. Drum patterns and bass lines are changing midway through songs. Both backing musicians are more than competent. Both seem like damn fine musicians. In fact, it's like Kind of Blue by Miles Davis. There's a definite feeling that these are not rehearsed songs. These are songs that feel like they were discussed maybe once before the engineer pressed record. And I like that very much. I love hearing musicians right on the hairy edge of their comfort zones. Growing up, listening to all things Allman, I had known the song Down Along the Cove, but I wasn't aware it was a Dylan tune. It was one of the tunes that Duane Allman recorded with Johnny Jenkins. It appeared on Tom Tom McCoot and also on the Duane Allman Anthology, Volume 1. The song Dear Landlord struck me for a couple reasons. The first is because it uses a chromatic trick that a lot of songs from the Great American Songbook use. All of Me, for example. This is not something I'd heard very often in Dylan's songwriting. The change from the simple chord changes on the rest of the album shook me out of what I had expected, and it made me pay special attention to Dear Landlord. The first thing I was reminded of was the Depression-era song We're in the Money from 42nd Street. The bridge to that song always struck me as interesting. It goes, we never see a headline about a breadline today, and when we see the landlord, we look that guy right in the eye. Think about what that says. This is an aspirational song about unobtainable wealth from the point of view of someone in the working class in the 1930s. That means if you're suffering through the Great Depression, even in your wildest fantasies about wealth and prosperity, you still had a landlord. I'll come back to this later, but I guess the important thing is owning a home and being out from under the control of a landlord was not always part of the American dream. Quick side story here. A few years ago, Emily and I went to see John Hodgman live. The comedian, writer John Hodgman used to be on The Daily Show. It was in the middle of the summer in a loft space with no air conditioning and an audience of about 150 sitting in metal folding chairs. It was very uncomfortable and it made Emily angry. But to close his show, he stripped down to his underwear, put on a dark blue evening gown, and while doing an impersonation of Ayn Rand sang "We're in the Money" while playing ukulele. It was one of the most out performances I've ever seen, and I really adore him for that. Okay, back to the album. One other thing to mention about my first couple of listens, as much of a fan of Hendrix as I am, I have to admit to being quite attracted to this version of All Along the Watchtower. It's cleaner, and I think more importantly, it puts the narrative in context. And that context is huge. The context for the album John Wesley Harding is everything. Here's what I hear. This album is a commentary on how America views itself. I read the autobiography of John Wesley Harding as research for this. He was not a friend to the poor. He was a white supremacist shithead who murdered over 40 people and spent the majority of his book bragging about what a badass he was. But that doesn't fit with the image America has of itself. Dylan is telling us that instead of facing our flaws, rather than questioning the concept of American exceptionalism, we make our gunslinger murderers into Robin Hoods, changing the facts as we go to fit the narrative. The real John Wesley Harding was never in Cheney County, but he was the guy who killed a guy just for snoring. I Dreamed I Saw St. Augustine is probably the most important song on this album. Augustine was a bishop of the Holy Roman Empire. He lived in northern Africa around the 5th century. And like modern America, the Romans of the 5th century thought that if you had wealth and power, it was a sign that you had worked harder or were otherwise more blessed by God. Therefore, wealth and power were seen as signs of divinity, and public displays of wealth were seen as a good for the population. If you were able to ostentatiously show how rich you were basically virtue signaling. Augustine said, bullshit. Just because you're poor doesn't mean you're evil, and just because you're rich doesn't mean you're virtuous. It's wrong to assume that you should use your power and influence as evidence of your moral superiority. Humanity will never be perfect, according to Augustine, because it is by necessity made up of imperfect individuals. In fact, the whole idea of perfection is not only unattainable, it's meaningless. And at the time, Augustine's message was so well received by the poor and working classes that when the Vandals invaded his home of Hippo, they burned the city down, they kidnapped all the women, but they left his church untouched. In the song, I Dreamed I Saw St. Augustine, Dylan dreamed that he was one of the people that killed Augustine, woke in anger, and cried. That is, Dylan is saying that in his subconscious, there was part of him that believed because he was successful, he was therefore entitled to it. He was better than those that were less successful. Waking and learning this about his aspect of his self-image, he cried, as it runs contrary to the working class, Woody Guthrie-inspired roots he came up from. It's a beautiful song, and it's immensely important. Incidentally, I thought about calling my mom to talk about this song. My mom's a huge Dylan fan. Plus, it would have been an interesting thing to talk about I Dreamed I Saw St. Augustine while talking to my mom, who lives in St. Augustine. As the album progresses, and Dylan addresses other aspects of American culture, like, for example, the aspirations of the American dream that we talked about in Dear Landlord, he ends on a blues tune, Down Along the Cove, and a Hank Williams-style high lonesome bluegrass song, I'll Be Your Baby Tonight, both of which have the inclusion of a steel guitar, the only time that instrument appears on the album, and that represents the advent of the guitar in black folk music and white Appalachian music, which would eventually combine to give us rock and roll. This is an important album. Listening to this album will reveal a lot about who you are and how you feel about being in the U.S. This is also an album that actually does what a lot of the late 70s, early 80s punks claim to do, and that is strip the music down to its absolute barest components. There are a couple of songs in this album that are essentially only a single chord, but there's not a weak track here at all. Like a lot of Dylan, though, you have to do your part. You can just let it enter your ear holes unquestioned if you want to, but to get the most out of this music, it really does help to know a few things first. About the real John Wesley Hardin, about Thomas Paine, about Augustine of Hippo, about the European immigration into the U.S. in the 1890s, and about really most of the things you could find out from folks like Howard Zinn. And while I didn't plan on dealing with these subjects at this particular moment in history, I do have to appreciate all the serendipity of it. On the other hand, this album would have been just as relevant at any time between now and, say, 1967.